Tonight, we unearth a story buried deep in the swamps of Louisiana, hidden beneath layers of silence, fear, and blood. A story of vengeance so chilling it turned kitchens into graveyards and whispers into curses. This is the story of Violet, a kitchen slave in 19th century New Orleans, who chose poison as her weapon. Before we begin, imagine the time, imagine the place. Comment below. If you had lived in 1830s New Orleans, what role would you have played? The master, the servant, or the silent witness? Now, let us begin. The kitchens of New Orleans plantations were places of fire, sweat, and silence. Stone walls trapped the heat of iron stoves, and the smell of boiling stews clung to the air like a ghost. Slaves labored endlessly, their hands raw from scrubbing, their bodies aching from the weight of hunger and exhaustion. Among them stood Violet. She was not old, not yet broken by years, but her eyes carried the depth of someone who had seen too much cruelty to belong to youth. She was a kitchen slave, tasked with preparing meals for the grand house above. Food in that house was more than survival, it was a performance. The masters dined in excess, their tables overflowing with meats, wines, and sauces. Every bite carried prestige. Every dish was crafted by enslaved hands. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered like broth left too long on the fire. Violet had once been known for her skill with spices. She understood flavor the way some understood music, instinctively, without teaching. Her touch transformed bland ingredients into delicacies, but in time, her gift became her curse. Her talents chained her to the kitchen, closer to the ones who despised her people the most. Whispers followed her in the slave quarters. They spoke of masters who fell ill, of meals that brought unexpected fevers, of coughs that turned to choking. But whispers were all they were, until the day the poison spread beyond rumor. The kitchen became her battlefield. Herbs were her weapons, powders her allies. The smallest pinch could mean the difference between life and death, between another night of suffering and the possibility of vengeance. The overseer never suspected her. She moved quietly, never looking up, never speaking unless forced to. Yet beneath her silence, a storm brewed. For Violet had known pain in its purest form, pain that could not be forgotten, could not be forgiven. The master of the house had taken from her everything that mattered. Family torn apart by auction, dignity stripped away, her body used and discarded like a tool. What remained was only a shell, and within that shell, hatred burned. Night after night, as the house grew quiet, Violet studied her craft. She knew which leaves, when steeped in boiling water, could twist a man's stomach into knots. She knew which powders dissolved into wine, tasteless and deadly. Knowledge passed in whispers from one enslaved woman to another, fragments of African tradition mingled with local lore. These secrets, dismissed as superstition by the white household, became Violet's arsenal. Her vengeance began not with fire or blade, but with a spoon dipped into stew. A cup of coffee laced with just enough to bring pain, but not death. A test, a warning. The first victim was not the master himself, but his favored guest, a merchant who dealt in human flesh, whose gold flowed from chains and misery. He dined, richly, laughing, his voice carrying through the halls as he toasted to fortunes made on suffering. Hours later, his laughter turned to gasps, his stomach twisted, his face drained of color. By dawn, he was dead. The household called it illness, a fever perhaps, or food gone sour. No one suspected Violet. Not yet. But she knew. She watched. And in her silence, she allowed herself the smallest flicker of something she had not felt in years: control. The death set the stage for what was to come. One man gone meant little in the world of the powerful, but Violet had tasted her first victory. And once vengeance begins, it does not rest. The kitchen's fires burned hotter, its shadows deeper. Each meal prepared carried the weight of possibility. Each sip of wine could be a gamble between survival and death. And though no one yet realized it, the grand house of New Orleans was slowly becoming a tomb. The morning after the merchant's death, the plantation house stirred uneasily. Death was not unusual in New Orleans. Yellow fever haunted the city like a phantom, claiming lives without warning. Swamp mists carried sickness, and even the richest homes were not immune. Still, unease clung to the air. The merchant had been healthy, vibrant, loud with drink and arrogance only hours before. His sudden collapse unsettled the household. The master dismissed it as chance, but the mistress clutched rosary beads tighter in her pale hands. Servants whispered in corners. Slaves in the quarters exchanged glances heavy with unspoken thoughts. Only Violet kept her silence. She moved through the kitchen as if nothing had changed. She chopped, stirred, boiled, and served. Her face betrayed nothing, but inside, her resolve deepened. One life was gone. Many more deserved to follow. Suspicion did not come immediately. The wealthy were blind to what lay beneath their feet. They saw only the surface of their feasts, not the hands that prepared them. But sickness began to return again and again, like an unwelcome guest. A cousin fell ill after dining in the grand hall. He complained of searing stomach pain, of a dryness in his throat that no amount of wine could quench. He recovered after days of torment. But whispers rose louder. Then a servant boy who had stolen scraps from the kitchen collapsed in the yard. His death was brushed aside as weakness, as the fragility of the poor. But Violet noticed the way the overseer's eyes lingered on the bowls and platters, the way suspicion began creeping closer to the kitchen fires. Fear spread like smoke through the household. Meals once greeted with laughter and indulgence were now consumed with hesitation. Every spoonful was studied. Every cup was sniffed. Some pushed food aside half-finished, uneasy but unwilling to voice their dread. The mistress demanded prayers before every meal. Candles burned longer in the chapel. Priests were called to bless the kitchen, sprinkling holy water over stone floors still damp with the sweat of enslaved cooks. But no blessing could wash away what had already seeped into the household. Violet's poisons were not always fatal. Sometimes she allowed her victims to recover, writhing in agony, but spared the final release of death. This uncertainty was its own weapon. To live in fear of every bite was worse than a sudden end. Yet with fear came danger. The overseer began watching the kitchen more closely. His eyes followed Violet as she worked, his presence heavy, a constant reminder that discovery meant brutal punishment, perhaps even execution. He did not know the truth, but he sensed it. The other slaves grew restless. Some admired Violet in silence, recognizing the power she wielded. Others trembled at the risk she brought upon them all. If the masters turned suspicion into fury, it would not fall on her alone. Punishment would be collective, swift, merciless. Still, Violet pressed forward. She had lived too long in chains to retreat now. Each successful strike strengthened her. Each pained gasp of the powerful reminded her that vengeance was no longer a dream whispered in the dark. It was real, unfolding before her eyes. Her greatest act of defiance came one storm-filled night. The rain hammered the shutters, the wind howled through the oaks, and thunder rolled across the bayou. The master had gathered wealthy allies for a supper, men whose fortunes grew fat on sugar, cotton, and flesh. They laughed as the storm battered the world outside, drunk on wine and arrogance. Violet served them a feast, roasted meats dripping with juices, vegetables bathed in butter, steaming bowls of rice and beans. But hidden within the feast was her most daring mixture yet. The storm raged. The men ate greedily. Hours later, screams echoed through the halls. Chairs overturned, goblets spilled, boots thundered against the floor as men doubled over in pain. The storm outside was mirrored by chaos within. By dawn, 2 were dead. 3 more lingered between life and death. The grand hall, once a place of indulgence, reeked of vomit, sweat, and death. This time, suspicion could not be ignored. The household knew something unnatural lurked within their walls. Rumors of poison took root, whispered first by servants, then echoed by the masters themselves. Fingers pointed toward the kitchen, and Violet. She remained in the shadows, silent as ever. But her silence no longer masked obedience. It masked a growing fire that would soon consume everything. The overseer swore to uncover the culprit. The mistress wept and demanded the guilty be punished. The master paced the halls, fury boiling beneath his skin. The slaves braced for retribution, hearts pounding with fear of what was to come. But still, Violet remained unseen, hidden in plain sight. A shadow with a spoon, a ghost with a vial. The house was unraveling. Fear ruled its halls. And though no one yet dared to name her, Violet had become its executioner. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered within the plantation house. The heavy air carried the scent of sickness, mingled with candle smoke and fear. Curtains were drawn tight, voices lowered to whispers. The household lived in dread, for death had crossed their tables, and suspicion sharpened like a knife. The master could no longer dismiss the deaths as chance. Too many had fallen ill. Too many had gasped their last breaths after eating food from his own kitchen. His pride bristled at the thought, for to admit weakness was to invite mockery from other planters. Yet his fear grew each day. He ordered an investigation. The overseer, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his suspicion, took charge. He prowled the kitchen like a wolf circling prey, his boots striking hard against the stone floor. His gaze swept over every pot, every knife, every trembling hand that dared lift a ladle. He sniffed at spices, tasted sauces with suspicion, and questioned every slave forced to work within those walls. Violet remained calm. Her movements were steady, her face expressionless. She offered no protest, no nervous glance. To betray fear was to invite ruin, and so she cloaked herself in silence. The overseer's interrogations grew harsher. He lined the cooks against the wall, eyes darting from face to face, searching for weakness. Some broke down in tears, swearing their innocence. Others stood mute, their fates bound to a game they could not win. For suspicion alone was enough to warrant punishment. Whips cracked in the yard. Innocent backs split beneath leather lashes as the overseer demanded confessions. Yet no one spoke Violet's name. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of admiration, or perhaps because vengeance in its rawest form spoke to them all. Still, the danger grew. The master brought in a physician from the city, a man who prided himself on reason and science. He examined the sick, studied the bodies of the dead, and sniffed at the kitchen stores. He spoke of poisons, of herbs and powders that could bring pain or death. He warned that someone within the household had knowledge beyond simple cooking. The word witchcraft was whispered. For the white household could not imagine that knowledge of plants and their deadly properties could come from skill, tradition, or survival. To them, such power was unnatural, dangerous, and surely tied to dark forces. The slaves heard these whispers and felt their own fear deepen. Witchcraft accusations had doomed others before. A single name spoken aloud could condemn Violet to the gallows or worse. Yet still, silence held. Violet, hidden behind her calm exterior, knew the danger of every step she took. Each pinch of powder, each drop of tincture, had to be measured not only for its effect, but for its secrecy. To kill too many too quickly was to invite discovery. To hesitate was to betray her cause. It was a careful dance, and each day the noose grew tighter. The overseer turned his suspicion inward, not only toward the slaves, but also toward the household itself. He eyed the mistress, whose delicate frame had grown gaunt with fear. He questioned the servants who poured wine, the boys who polished silver. Trust unraveled. Every hand, every glance became suspect. Meals were tested before they reached the master's table. Dogs were fed scraps first, their reactions watched closely. And yet, despite these precautions, sickness returned again and again. Violet was patient, adjusting her methods, ensuring her hand remained invisible. Sometimes the poison lingered in the wine. Other times it hid in sauces too rich for suspicion. She varied her craft, weaving death into meals with the precision of a hunter setting traps. The physician grew frustrated. He could identify the signs of poison, but never the source. His warnings turned desperate, his reputation threatened by his inability to solve the mystery. The master, in turn, grew enraged. His pride could not bear the whispers spreading through New Orleans. Rumors of a cursed household, of a planter who could not protect his own table. Punishments grew more severe. Slaves were beaten for the smallest mistakes, their cries echoing across the yard. Some were sold away in fear that they carried guilt. Others were starved, denied even the scraps they once relied on. The overseer's fury fell hardest on the innocent, but still, Violet remained untouched, hidden within the very shadows of suspicion. And yet, the danger pressed closer. One evening, the physician, weary and defeated, sat with the master in the candlelit hall. He warned that if the poisoner was not found, the entire household could fall. The master's fury turned cold. He swore to burn the kitchen to the ground, to kill every slave within its walls if another death occurred. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Violet heard it whispered among the quarters, carried on trembling lips. Fear consumed those around her. To many, vengeance no longer seemed worth the risk. But for Violet, retreat was impossible. Her heart was already bound to her cause. If the kitchen was to burn, she would not go quietly. She would take more lives before her own was extinguished. The investigation had failed. The overseer had punished but found nothing. The physician had studied but solved nothing. The master had threatened but controlled nothing. And so the house remained trapped, a prison of dread, its walls echoing with suspicion, and at the center of it all, Violet stood silent, her vengeance sharpening like a blade in the dark. The house no longer felt like a home. It was a fortress of fear, a cage of suspicion, where every creak of the floorboards carried dread. The grand dining table, once a symbol of power and excess, had become an altar of unease. No one sat without glancing at their plate. No one drank without hesitation. And still, Violet cooked. Her hands moved as they always had, steady, precise, obedient to the eye that watched her. But beneath that stillness, vengeance churned hotter than the fires that boiled the pots. She knew the master's threat. If another death came, the kitchen would burn, and every slave within it would be sacrificed to his fury. Yet the threat did not silence her. It fueled her. For to Violet, death had already taken what mattered most. She had been stripped of kin, of freedom, of body and soul. Her world had been fire and lash, hunger and silence. The master had destroyed her life long ago. Now she would destroy his. Her poisons grew bolder. No longer content with subtle fevers or lingering pains, she prepared mixtures designed to kill swiftly, to cut through flesh and bone with merciless finality. The first was slipped into a bowl of gumbo served to a visiting planter, a man known for his cruelty. He boasted of the slaves he had whipped, of the profits he wrung from suffering. That night he writhed on the floor of the guest chamber, his screams tearing through the silence until his voice broke. By dawn, he was gone. The household descended into panic. Guards were placed at the kitchen doors. Meals were tasted by servants before reaching the table. Yet even under this watch, Violet struck again. A young overseer, arrogant in his authority, fell after drinking wine at supper. His lips turned blue, his body shuddering as the life drained from him. 2 deaths in less than a month. The threat of fire loomed, yet the master hesitated. To burn the kitchen meant to lose the meals that fed his wealth, the delicacies that elevated his standing among other planters. His pride battled his fear, and in that hesitation, Violet thrived. The slaves in the quarters lived on edge. Some prayed for Violet's vengeance to continue, a silent retribution against years of torment. Others trembled at the danger, fearing that the master's fury would soon consume them all. The whisper of her name passed in the dark, never spoken aloud but understood. The mistress, fragile and pale, sank deeper into hysteria. She refused to eat unless she prepared the food herself, her hands trembling as she tried to cook. Yet even then, her paranoia consumed her. She accused servants, cursed the slaves, begged priests to drive out the evil within her home. But none of it brought peace. The master's rage grew colder. He locked away the wine cellars, refused all visitors, and sat at his table with a pistol at his side, daring death to come for him. But death was patient. Death wore the face of a quiet kitchen slave who stirred her pots without a sound. Outside, New Orleans pulsed with life. The markets bustled, carriages clattered, and the river flowed steadily past the city. But inside the plantation walls, decay spread. The house was no longer feared for its wealth or power. It was whispered about as cursed. Neighbors spoke of spirits, of African sorcery, of a house where meals brought death, and Violet, unseen yet ever present, wove her vengeance into the fabric of that legend. Her next strike was not aimed at a guest or overseer. It was aimed at the master's own blood. His eldest son, proud and arrogant like his father, had returned from a journey to Baton Rouge. At supper, he mocked the slaves, his laughter echoing through the hall. Violet served him stew, her expression blank as he devoured it greedily. Hours later, he collapsed. His body convulsed. Foam spilled from his lips. His eyes rolled back until only the whites remained. The master watched as his son gasped his final breaths, powerless to stop it. His fury erupted, a storm greater than any before. He struck the table, cursed the slaves, and vowed that blood would pay for blood. The next morning, the overseer dragged men and women into the yard. Whips cracked, chains rattled, screams tore through the air. Innocent backs split open, innocent bodies writhed in agony. The master demanded confessions, but none were given. Violet remained silent, her face unreadable as she endured the storm. Punishment spread like wildfire, but the poisonings did not cease. For Violet had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Her vengeance was no longer measured, no longer patient. It was relentless, insatiable. And the house, once a monument of wealth and power, was now rotting from within. By night, the halls echoed with whispers of curses. By day, the sun revealed eyes hollowed by fear. The plantation, built on cruelty, was now devouring itself. At its heart stood Violet, the silent hand of vengeance, waiting for the moment when the final blow would fall. The plantation stood like a wounded beast. Its fields stretched wide, its profits still flowed, yet within its walls, rot had taken hold. The deaths had become too many to hide. Whispers spread beyond the household, drifting through the streets of New Orleans, carried by merchants, priests, and slaves alike. They called the place cursed. They said a spirit of vengeance haunted the master's table, striking down all who dared feast upon it. Some swore it was the work of the devil. Others whispered of African magic, ancient knowledge hidden in roots and leaves. Whatever the cause, the house had become a tomb, And its master, once a figure of pride, was mocked behind closed doors. He could not bear it. The master's pride was a fortress, but every death cracked its stones. When his eldest son had gasped his last breath on the dining hall floor, his fury had curdled into desperation. His wealth, his status, even his very name, all were now threatened by an enemy he could not see. He vowed that no more would die by his table. The overseer was given free rein. Chains rattled in the yard as slaves were locked away, denied even water. Whips cracked daily, blood soaking the dust. The overseer tore through the quarters, searching for secrets, for hidden vials or powders, but he found nothing. Violet's skill was too careful, her hand too precise. She carried no evidence, left no trace. The master turned next to the church. Priests arrived in their black robes, chanting prayers through the halls, sprinkling holy water on walls that had seen too much blood. They blessed the kitchen, pressed crosses into the hands of the mistress, and warned that the devil walked among them. Yet still, death came. The master, desperate for control, banned all spices, all herbs, all ingredients beyond the simplest bread and meat. The meals, once grand displays of indulgence, were reduced to bland, meager portions. Yet even then, sickness lingered. A guest who braved the cursed table found his throat closing within hours, gasping until silence claimed him. Paranoia consumed the household. Servants refused to eat. Slaves were too frightened to touch scraps. Even the master and mistress tasted only what was forced upon them, chewing each bite as though it might be their last. The sound of forks scraping against empty plates replaced the laughter that once filled the hall. The mistress grew gaunt, her eyes hollow from hunger and fear. She whispered that the house was damned, that shadows followed her from room to room. Her prayers turned frantic, her nights restless. The master, once dismissive of her fragility, now shared her dread. He could no longer deny what haunted his home. If poison was the weapon, then the poisoner still lived among them, unseen, unpunished. His fury turned not only toward the slaves, but toward the very walls of his house. He demanded answers, demanded blood. Rumors spread through the city. Some said he had made a pact with the devil and now paid the price. Others claimed the ghosts of those he had chained and sold had returned to claim vengeance. The name of his household became a warning, a shadow cast across the plantations of Louisiana. And still, Violet remained untouched. Her silence was her armor. She worked as always, her face calm, her movements precise. To watch her was to see nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. She was the invisible hand, the ghost in the kitchen. But even she knew the walls were closing in. The master's threats grew sharper. His eyes lingered longer on every servant, every slave. His rage was no longer blind, it was hunting. And the overseer's gaze followed her more than before. Yet Violet did not falter. She had crossed beyond the reach of fear. If she was to be discovered, then she would not fall quietly. She would take more with her, drag the master's world into ruin before they dragged her to her grave. One night, under a moonless sky, she prepared her boldest strike yet. A meal not for guests, not for overseers, but for the master himself. The very man whose hands had built her cage, whose cruelty had destroyed her life. As the dish left her hands, she knew the risk was absolute. If suspicion turned to certainty, her life would end in fire or rope, but her vengeance demanded it. The master sat at his table, pistol at his side, daring death to come for him. He ate slowly, cautiously, eyes sharp as though to stare down the very shadow that haunted him. Hours passed. His chest tightened, his lips paled. A cough racked his body, then another. His pistol fell from his hand. He stumbled, gasping, fury and terror twisting across his face. The house erupted into chaos. Servants screaming, slaves trembling in silence. The master collapsed upon the floor where so many others had fallen before him. His pride shattered, his power broken. He writhed in the final throes of agony, and Violet watched, hidden in the shadows of the kitchen, as the man who had ruled her life with iron and blood finally met his end. The house, leaderless, shook with panic. The overseer bellowed orders, the mistress wailed, but none could undo what had been done. The master was dead, but vengeance was not yet complete, for Violet's poison had left behind more than bodies. It had left fear, suspicion, and ruin. And the household, desperate and broken, was only beginning to collapse. The master was dead. His body, once carried with pride and arrogance, now lay cold upon the floor of his own dining hall. The house that had echoed with his commands was suddenly silent, broken only by the sobs of the mistress and the shouts of the overseer as he tried to seize control. Yet, control was gone. The plantation was a body without a spine. Its master, feared and hated, had been its center of power. Without him, the household cracked apart. Servants fled their duties. Slaves moved cautiously, no longer crushed beneath the weight of his presence. The mistress, fragile and trembling, could not command obedience. And the overseer, though brutal, was only a shadow of authority compared to the man he had served. Rumors spread like wildfire. News of the master's death traveled across the bayou, carried into the city by merchants, and whispered by slaves to one another. Some claimed he had choked on his own greed. Others swore spirits had dragged him into the grave. And still others spoke of poison, though none dared name who held the vial. The plantation itself seemed to wither. Fields stood untended, the sugar, cane, rotting in the heat. The grand house, once a place of indulgence, was cloaked in mourning. Black cloth draped over mirrors. Candles burned day and night, their wax staining the floors. The mistress drifted through the halls like a ghost, her mind unraveling, clutching rosary beads as though they might hold back the shadow that had consumed her family. The overseer's fury grew savage. He knew his own survival depended on control, and so he ruled with blood. Slaves were chained, beaten, and starved. Entire families were threatened with the auction block. He screamed for confessions, swore he would burn the poisoner alive, but no name came. The silence of the quarters held strong, for Violet remained hidden, her vengeance cloaked by shadows. She watched the overseer's rage with cold eyes. She had already struck down the master, but her thirst was not yet satisfied. Too much blood had been spilled, too much cruelty endured. The overseer had wielded the whip, had carried out the master's commands with relish. He too deserved a reckoning. And so she prepared again. This time her strike was not for subtlety. The household was already broken, suspicion already beyond repair. She no longer sought to hide, she sought to end. One evening, the overseer gathered what remained of the household for a meal. He barked orders, demanded obedience, and swore to restore order. He sat at the master's place at the head of the table, a false king in a ruined court. Violet served the meal. Her face was calm, her hands steady. She poured wine into his cup, set the plates before him. The overseer sneered, certain that his presence, his violence, made him untouchable. But as the candles flickered, his bravado faltered. He lifted the cup, drank deeply, and within minutes, his face twisted. He clutched his stomach, gasped for breath, and fell to the floor convulsing. The slaves watched in silence as the overseer's body writhed. Some turned their eyes away. Others allowed themselves the faintest glimmer of relief. For years, his cruelty had weighed upon them. Now, in the flicker of candlelight, that weight crumbled. By dawn, he was gone. The mistress wailed, her grief spiraling into madness. She raved about curses, about witches in her kitchen, about shadows that poisoned her family. She locked herself away, refusing to eat, refusing to sleep. Her mind broke beneath the terror of a fate she could not name. The plantation was undone. No master, no overseer, only fear, suspicion, and ruin. The slaves, long bound in chains, saw, the cracks widening. Some whispered of escape, of fleeing into the swamps and vanishing into the world beyond. Others prayed, unsure if freedom waited or if only more suffering lay ahead. And at the center of it all, Violet stood unseen, her vengeance nearly complete. She had poisoned the master. She had struck down his allies. She had ended the overseer. All that remained was the mistress, fragile and broken, the last remnant of a house built on cruelty. Violet's silence masked her thoughts, but her heart burned with the weight of choice. Would she let the mistress waste away in madness, consumed by her own fear? Or would she deliver the final blow, ensuring that no trace of that cursed household remained? The answer lingered in the shadows, waiting. The plantation was dying, its power unraveling with each heartbeat. The slaves watched, the city whispered, and the world beyond moved closer to consuming the ruins. But Violet's vengeance was not yet finished. The plantation was a corpse. Its master rotted in the grave. Its overseer lay in the ground beside him. The fields once kept with brutal order grew wild and untended, stalks of cane bending under the swamp heat. The slaves no longer marched in lines to the fields. They lingered in silence, caught between fear and the strange, intoxicating taste of freedom. At the heart of the house, one figure still clung to its shattered authority, the mistress. She wandered, the halls in torn silk, her hair uncombed, her rosary clutched so tightly her fingers bled. Her eyes were hollow, her voice shrill with prayers that carried no power. She believed herself cursed, haunted by something not of this world. She locked doors, covered mirrors, burned incense until the smoke stung her lungs. Yet nothing could keep away the presence that lingered in the walls, a presence she could neither see nor name. The house itself seemed to groan beneath her madness. Floorboards creaked like whispers in the night. Candles sputtered out as though suffocated by unseen hands. Doors slammed shut on their own. Whether these were the tricks of a breaking mind or the true stirrings of restless spirits, no one could tell, and Violet remained unseen, watching. Her vengeance had nearly run its course. The master's cruelty had ended in agony. The overseer's brutality had been cut short. Now only the mistress remained, the woman who had turned her head away from every scream, who had enjoyed the fruits of blood and labor while claiming innocence. She too was guilty, but Violet hesitated. The mistress was already broken, crumbling under fear and despair. Some whispered she would not live the season, that madness would soon claim her life without any need for poison. Others said it was cruelty enough to leave her in a house of shadows, stripped of power, her wealth turned into rot. Yet vengeance is rarely content with silence. One night, as the storm winds rattled the shutters, Violet stepped into the mistress's chamber. The woman lay on her bed, trembling, her rosary clutched against her chest. A tray of untouched food sat nearby, the wine glass trembling where her hands had set it aside. Violet's work was delicate, practiced. A vial hidden in her apron, a drop stirred into the wine, the liquid swirling into darkness. No sound, no word, only the quiet precision of a hand that had done this before. The mistress reached for the cup, her lips trembling with whispered prayers. She drank, and with each swallow, her prayers faltered. The poison moved slowly, cruelly. Her body stiffened, her breath grew ragged, her eyes rolled back into her skull. She clawed at her throat, as though she could tear the poison from within. Her rosary fell to the floor, the beads scattering across the wooden planks. By dawn, the mistress was gone, and with her death, the house finally fell silent. The slaves stood in the courtyard, watching the smoke rise from the chimneys, where the last of the mistress's possessions were burned. They did not weep. They did not pray for her soul. They only stood, waiting for what would come next. Some left under cover of night, fleeing into the bayou, never to be seen again. Others remained, uncertain, drifting between the ruins of bondage. And the hope of something freer, the plantation became a ruin. The fields decayed. The grand house rotted, its walls splitting, its roof sagging. Travelers spoke of it as cursed, a place where spirits wandered and the air stank of decay. No master came to claim it. No overseer dared rebuild it. And through the whispers of New Orleans, Violet became legend. They called her the poisoner, the kitchen slave who struck down her masters one by one. Some said she had sold her soul to the devil, that her vengeance was fueled by something unholy. Others claimed she was no more than justice itself, wearing flesh, striking with a hand steady enough to finish what fate had begun. Her true fate was never known. Some believed she fled into the swamps, her figure glimpsed in the mist, carrying the memory of her vengeance into the dark. Others swore she remained in the ruins, her spirit haunting the kitchen where the first vial was poured, her shadow lingering in the places where wine once tasted of death. But the story of Violet's vengeance endured. Passed from mouth to mouth, carried across the city, woven into the whispers of the bayou, it lived on long after the plantation had fallen into the earth. A warning, a ghost tale, a testament to a woman who had been forced into chains, yet who turned her suffering into fire, her silence into poison, her servitude into power. The house of cruelty had been fed by her hands, and in the end, by those same hands, it had been undone. The legacy of Violet's vengeance would never be forgotten.